Good afternoon, distinguished guests, faculty, current and former Golden Bears, midshipmen and cadets, and friends. I'm Captain Randy Van Rossum, Professor of Naval Science and the current Commanding Officer of Berkeley's Naval ROTC Unit. Welcome to Berkeley's 41st Annual Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Memorial Lectureship in National Security Affairs, which since 1985 has hosted a distinguished scholar, military professional, or government official for a series of lectures on national security and leadership subjects. This year, we've decided to adjust the format a bit by having a distinguished guest, who will be introduced in a minute, perform moderator duties. I am confident this will lead to a fulfilling and rewarding discussion. Most of you know Fleet Admiral Nimitz was the commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific during World War II. However, he also has a strong connection to Berkeley. In 1926, he founded Berkeley's Naval Reserve Officer Training Corps as its first commanding officer, one of the original 6 NROTC units in the nation. After the war, Admiral Nimitz became the 10th Chief of Naval Operations and tackled the immediate demobilization of our fleet, as well as Operation Magic Carpet, which brought home more than 2 million American service members over a period of 6 months. After finally being allowed to retire, Fleet Admiral Nimitz returned to Berkeley, living at 728 Santa Barbara Road, not quite 2 miles northeast of here. He also served as a regent for the University of California, and his son, Chester Nimitz Jr., would serve as executive officer of Berkeley's NROTC unit. UC Berkeley NROTC is composed of 47 young men and women who have volunteered to serve their country as officers in the United States Navy or the Marine Corps after they earn their undergraduate degrees. UC Berkeley also hosts midshipmen from our crosstown universities of Stanford, California State University Maritime Academy, and UC Davis. Berkeley also hosts Army and Air Force ROTC under the outstanding leadership of Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Elliott and Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Fife, respectively, all under the Military Affairs program in the College of Letters and Science. Army ROTC beat Navy to Berkeley in 1916, though it had been training officers at Berkeley since 1870, and started commissioning officers into the Army Air Corps in 1920. The Air Force officially arrived at Berkeley in 1951. It's fantastic to be able to educate and mentor tomorrow's military officers here at Berkeley. Public service has always had a great need for our best and brightest, and leadership in our nation's armed forces is no exception. The United States is indeed fortunate to have young men and women volunteer to do so, and I thank all at Berkeley who support this effort, not just in supporting ROTC, but in providing that Berkeley education that is so valuable. I want to especially thank our chairman of the Military Officers Education Committee, Professor Mark Brilliant, and our members, Professors Jonathan Wertelli, Panos Papadopoulos, Daniela Coffer, Richard Rhodes, Daniel Sargent, Daniel Siefman, and Eric Schickler for all of their continued support. As someone who is wearing a uniform of the Armed Forces of the United States and who is also humbled to be a member of the faculty here at Berkeley, I'm obligated to put out the standard disclaimer. The opinions you will hear today are not those of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or the University of California, Berkeley. They are those of our guest, an esteemed and experienced leader and scholar, and that is their value, to add to the diversity of opinions available and encourage us all to think deeply of the challenges that face us all. With that said, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jennifer Johnson-Hanks, a distinguished figure whose illustrious academic journey commenced with her BA from Berkeley, followed by an MA and PhD in anthropology from Northwestern. Dr. Johnson-Hanks has made significant contributions to the fields of sociology and demography at Berkeley through her joint appointments in these departments. She plays a pivotal leadership role as the executive dean for the College of Letters and Science after having served as the chair of the Berkeley Division of the Academic Senate. Dr. Johnson-Hanks is near and dear to our hearts for her support of the UC Berkeley ROTC programs, underlining her dedication to nurturing a wide array of opportunities and support networks for students. Her work exemplifies a commitment to academic excellence and leadership. Alongside fostering an inclusive and supportive educational environment, Furthermore, it is with great honor that she will introduce our keynote speaker and moderator. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dean Jennifer Johnson-Hanks.
Thank you very much. That was incredibly generous. So it is my enormous pleasure to introduce our two speakers today. I'll begin with Professor Daniel Sargent. Professor Sargent is a national leader in studies of the history of American foreign relations. Professor in the Department of History and in the Goldman School of Public Policy, Professor Sargent also co-directs Berkeley's Institute for International Studies. Before coming to Berkeley, Professor Sargent earned double first-class honors in Cambridge, his PhD at Harvard, and then a postdoc at Yale. His honors include the William C. Bark National Fellowship at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and the Stuart L. Burneth Lecture Prize from the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. Professor Sargent has also been a clarion voice for intellectual liberty in our university. I've been so grateful for his intellectual commitment to freedom of thought. His first book, published by Oxford Press in 2015, is entitled Superpower Transformed: The Remaking of American Foreign Relations in the 1970s. It is a wonderful book, and I have the last 2 lines of it taped up in my office, lest I ever get a little too proud of my own accomplishments. Of 3 American presidents, Professor Sargent writes, theirs, in the end, were stories not of great power and vast agency, inscribed upon history in the realization of bold and purposeful designs, but of frustration, adaptation, and constraint. That sort of feels like my life most of the time. It is also my enormous pleasure to introduce General John Rutherford Allen. General Allen is a distinguished retired 4-star general with a legacy of global leadership and innovation. A former commander of NATO's International Security Assistance Force and U.S. forces in Afghanistan, General Allen led a coalition of nearly 150,000 troops through one of the most complex theaters of modern conflict. Following his military retirement, General Allen served as a senior advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Middle East security, spearheading security dialogues with Israel and the Palestinian Authority. At the request of President Obama, he became special presidential envoy to the global coalition to counter ISIL, successfully expanding that coalition to 65 nations. A key architect of U.S. policy in the Asia-Pacific, General Allen served as the principal director of the Asia-Pacific policy in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, shaping initiatives involving Taiwan, China, Mongolia, and Southeast Asia. He played a pivotal role in coordinating the multinational response to the 2004 South Asian tsunami and contributed to the 6-party talks on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. General Allen's military career spanned numerous global conflicts, including global areas, including the Caribbean, the Balkans, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In Iraq, he supported the formation of the Anbar Awakening, a movement critical to defeating al-Qaeda in the region. As deputy commander of the U.S. Central Command, he oversaw strategic operations in Central Asia and the Middle East. Today, General Allen serves as a strategic advisor to the Microsoft Corporation, where he provides counsel on emerging technologies, artificial intelligence, and global security. His expertise in artificial intelligence policy is reflected in his co-authored works, including Turning Point, Policymaking in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, and Future War and the Defense of Europe. General Allen's contributions have been recognized with numerous U.S. military and civilian awards and international decoration from 10 nations. General Allen is Distinguished Graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and has served as Commandant of Midshipmen, the first Marine officer to hold this post. He is a permanent member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and senior fellow at Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. Visionary leader and innovator, General Allen continues to bridge the worlds of security, technology, and diplomacy, driving progress in global sustainability and technological advancement. On behalf of the College of Letters and Science at UC Berkeley, I'm enormously grateful to you, sir, for joining us, and I look forward to your comments.
Great. Since I have the first word in this conversation, I'll use it to thank Dean Johnson-Hanks, Jenna Johnson-Hanks, for a very generous introduction. General Allen, I wonder if we could start out by looking back at the period since the end of the Cold War. As you know, because Dean mentioned in her introduction, I'm a historian, so I want to invite you to assess the past 30, 35 years, the period since the end of the Cold War, as a distinctive historical phase. How would you characterize the major developments in military affairs over this period? It might be intuitive to posit that the rise and fall of counterinsurgency was the defining theme of this era. Would you agree, or would you posit alternative frameworks?
Well, one thing I've always learned is never get on a stage with a historian, because invariably they know more than you do on almost every subject. Captain, thank you for the invitation again, and Dean, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I wish my wife was here, because she wouldn't have believed it otherwise. Let me just make a couple of broad comments. First, it is wonderful to see the NROTC units here. It's hard to overstate how much this nation relies on the product of these programs. Now, obviously, I have a lot more experience with NROTC programs, which produce officers for our Navy and the Marine Corps. But over the years, especially since I commanded Joint Forces, I had the great honor of serving with officers out of the Air Force and the Army as well. And these NROTC programs are national treasures. And so it's terrific that you're part of it. It's terrific that this institution, this school, fosters and embraces the NROTC and ROTC programs. And I can't speak highly enough of what you all have done and will do for this country. So thank you for your commitment so far to the NROTC and ROTC programs. And I wish you the very best as you graduate and go on to other things. And this lecture series, Chester Nimitz was probably one of the great unsung leaders of this country's history. We called Ray Spruance the quiet warrior, but Chester Nimitz in many ways was the quiet warrior as well. A brilliant strategic thinker. He masterminded the Central Pacific Drive, which really delivered us to a position where we were going to end the war on terms favorable ultimately to us. I didn't know him personally, but I did study under his biographer, E.B. Potter. So it was like getting to know him personally. And I don't know what book you use here for sea power if you still teach the course. But E.B. Potter's book on sea power was just fantastic. And if you've not read it, I would suggest that you do read it. And other members of the audience here today, folks from the civilian community, distinguished veterans, members of the Navy League, the Marine Corps League, and if there's a Gold Star family or a Gold Star member here, you have my instantaneous respect. Thank you all for coming today. This is really a great opportunity for me. I just love this school. I love this program. Just a little bit on my family as well. I come from a Navy family. I was born into a Navy family. Grew up, enlisted when I was 17. Ultimately was accepted to the Naval Academy and then spent the next 42 years in the service. My father was a black shoe sailor, a tin can sailor, a destroyerman. Very, very proud of having been a destroyerman. He served in the USS Kearney, and for those of you who know the history, the Kearney was torpedoed by a German U-boat. Before the war started, he was on one of the secret convoy missions that Roosevelt gave to Churchill as the British were being strangled by the U-boat fleet. And so on the 17th of October 1941, his destroyer, depth charging the wolf pack that was destroying this British convoy, was torpedoed. He was wounded. They limped into, barely made it, but they limped into Iceland, where he was repairing the radios in Radio Central when the radio came alive and we were bombed at Pearl Harbor. So his war began early. He fought across the Atlantic several times, into the Mediterranean, where his destroyer sank 3 German U-boats, was transferred to the Pacific, where he then served with Admiral Nimitz' drive across the Pacific. My wife, on the other hand, is a Marine junior, 3rd generation Marine junior. When I retired from the Marine Corps, we'd had a Marine in our family for 99 years on active duty straight. from World War I, World War II. World War I is an interesting story. I don't mean to deflect this, but it's kind of interesting. World War I, the Lieutenant Batchelder, who was serving in the 14th Marines on the Western Front, was wounded and sent to the Army Field Hospital, where he met and married the Army nurse who took care of him. And it was a wonderful romance story for our family. He would later go on to command the 25th Marine Regiment, regimental landing team at the landings at Kwajalein, Saipan, Tinian, and was the Chief of Staff of the 4th Division at the landing of Iwo Jima. My mother-in-law was married twice. Her first husband was a Raider in the 4th Marines when the Raiders were consolidated into the 4th Marines, made the assault landing on Guam, and was killed in action leading Gulf Company, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines on Okinawa 6 weeks before the end of the war. I said she was married twice. Her second husband was also a Marine, an Edson Raider, who was wounded on Guadalcanal after landing in Tulagi. So service in the Naval Service runs deep for me, and that's why it's so wonderful to see you all here today, because every single one of you has your moment coming. There are battlefields out there we've never heard of, but your moment is coming, and the things you will learn here today, when I say today, in this curriculum, with these great examples among these officers who are serving, whether they're a Navy, Marine Corps, Army, or Air Force, they are preparing you now for that moment of truth on a battlefield we've not even heard of yet. So I wish you all continued good studies and try to learn as much as you can here. Okay, I'm pretty old, so I'm not sure I remember the question, but you talked about the significant military developments in the aftermath of the Cold War.
That's right. What have been the big trends of the post-war era?
They've been significant, obviously. Beyond the probably most significant existential threat or trend has been the development of nuclear weapons, obviously, and the fine-tuning of our nuclear arsenal, the triad, our bomber force, our ballistic missile force, and our submarine force, which is underway in a major modernization now. It's the first one in a very long time, and we desperately needed it. So nuclear weapons is one. Then we have what I would say was the conscious commitment of the United States to this thing that is often used euphemistically, sometimes tritely, this revolution, so-called revolution of military affairs. But really what happened was that the United States in the late 50s, early 60s, began to experiment with the sophisticated technologies that were becoming available by virtue of the capacity of computing. Compute power, capacity for us to begin to use some of the earliest kinds of algorithmic research that was possible. And when we committed ourselves as a force, when I say force, I mean everybody, we committed ourselves as a force to this revolution of military affairs, it gave us the capacity to see the world in a different way. Now, those of you who've had to suffer through Clausewitz, everybody raise your hand if you've had a Clausewitz class. Okay. The senior folks in here are well versed in it. Clausewitz said that war has two real components to it: the character of war and the nature of war. And the character of war is that which is the technical dimension of war. The nature of war is the human dimension of war. And when we consciously chose to pursue a revolution in military affairs, we began to concentrate on much of the technical dimension of war. And from that, we would see second, third, and fourth generation fighter technologies. We would see stealth technologies that came about that gave us enormous advantage over our competitors and our opponents and our enemies. We saw air defense capabilities that we could not have imagined because of the phased array radars that were just a glimmer in someone's eye. But I think I saw an air defender in here earlier today, an Army air defender. If you were here, raise your hand. I saw that patch on your shoulder. Well done. The Patriot missile system is one of the most advanced air defense systems in the world. The Israelis would argue maybe the Arrow is, and I think the Arrow just proved itself to be pretty good recently. So the advances in technology that we were able to pursue because of compute power, because of the employment of artificial intelligence, gave us really unparalleled capabilities in the technical sense, which was the key developments in the period of time in the aftermath of the Cold War. Now, I said there are two real components here. You have the character of war and you have the nature of war. And the nature of war is all about how the human dimension of war wields these capabilities. And we have seen, and Clausewitz would propose, that when they are in a proper equilibrium, where those who would wield the technologies fully understand their capacities and wield them to the maximum extent, given the nature of the war, which is also part of Clausewitz's determination for all of us to do the analysis on the nature of war, the character of war. When those two are in equilibrium, we're in pretty good shape. But when they get out of equilibrium, then strategic surprise occurs. And the challenge for us today is that as technology is changing, it's not just changing, the rate of change of technology has made it very challenging for the nature of war, the human dimension, to keep up with these changes. And that's the real challenge for us today. Several years ago, an admiral by the name of Mike Mullen and I represented the Department of the Navy in a study on the education of the officers of the Naval Service, Navy and Marine Corps. And we determined very early along that the technical advances of the fleet and of the Marine Corps were such that our education processes hadn't really kept up. They hadn't kept up in the capacity to teach our leaders how to wield those capabilities to the fullest extent. And it hadn't kept up really in our understanding about our ethical obligations, our moral and ethical obligations, with the enormity of the firepower and destructiveness of these capabilities. Had we been educating our young officers at the very start of their careers to the point where they command large formations in battle, had we been educating them properly? And the decision was no, we haven't been. And that's not a condemnation of the Department of the Navy or the Naval Service. It is that the change in the character of war had gone on so fast that the curricula in schools, which sometimes don't move very quickly, needed to catch up quickly. And so I think to the great credit of the Department of the Navy and certainly Mike Mullen leading the charge, we began to embrace a very conscious effort to, as your question would imply, as these developments have emerged, are we intellectually, as a corps of officers, ready to understand those developments and then apply them to the maximum extent possible? Now, just to come back to a subtext in your question, the rise and fall of counterinsurgency. Certainly, we were forced into an environment for 20 years where counterinsurgency was the sort of rule of thumb. But we, in the Marine Corps anyway, we continually chose to depict ourselves as a Marine Corps Combined Arms Force, a MAGTAF, Air-Ground Task Force. And because of that, we always prepared ourselves for the high-intensity big war while we were forced ultimately onto the sand to deal with a counterinsurgency environment. Now, over time, frankly and sadly, we began to see that trend, that bias towards the potential to fight the big war began to erode. It eroded in our procurement programs, it eroded in our training programs, and we came out of 20 years of war fixed on counterinsurgency in one particular region, and we, in many respects, took our eyes off the great challenge that was emerging in East Asia with the Chinese and their technological capabilities and their capacity to produce at speeds and at levels we can't imagine. We still are trying to catch them. So lots of technological developments, efforts to try to keep up intellectually with those developments, and I think we're still engaged in that today.
I wonder if I might invite you to introduce another element to the framework that you've just sketched out. It's a very powerful framework that invites us to think about the relationship between military leadership and technological innovation in military affairs. But what about civilian political leadership? I was struck in your response, I think a couple of times you used the passive voice to describe the decision-making that thrust the United States military into counterinsurgency. We were forced. Does that suggest that we need to think hard about the role of senior civilian political leadership in shaping sort of the parameters of choice for military leaders?
That's a really important question. For a number of years, I would, and I got busy doing other things and couldn't continue, but for both the Army and for the Marine Corps, I would meet with their brand new brigadiers and talk to them about the role of a general officer in civil military affairs. And what I told them was that you may work for a civilian who is steeped in military history or who is a veteran who has served for some period of time in uniform, but the fact that less than 1% of the American population serves the entirety of this nation on active duty in the military, and the entirety of all of our veterans is such a small number given the size of our population, chances are, as a senior officer, you're going to work for a civilian who has no experience whatsoever. And so the onus really is on us. The onus is on you all to understand that the absence of that experience isn't a weakness. The absence of that experience is an opportunity. So that an officer, and I can't emphasize this enough to your discipline, an officer must be a student of the profession of arms. If you don't have a book under your arm all the time that you're reading about military history, you ought to be nervous about whether you're doing your duty or not. Because officers who can work with the civilian leadership and imbue them with the enormity of the responsibility that they hold, and the responsibility to the country, but also obviously to the forces, this is a really unique opportunity for serving officers. And early along, as I was a general for 10 years, early along, another general, a more senior fellow who I had known for many years, took me aside and said, you know, you have one real obligation to the civilian leadership in this country. You've got lots of obligations, but the one real leadership is to give them your best military advice. Best military advice. And so I took it on as a personal objective, personal obligation, to try to educate the civilians with whom I worked, and I was a principal director for Asia and Pacific Affairs, working for a civilian. Now, he had been an operator in the CIA for many years in Northeast Asia, so he had sort of an idea of what all of this was about. But there were other civilians who had no military experience, but they wanted to understand their obligations to their country, their obligations to the Constitution, their obligation to the services that they were leading. So it's been a rough road. Often civilian leaders don't want to hear from the military because they think they know better. Sometimes military leaders disdain the civilians because they know better. The truth is, of course, we have to work together. We have to work very, very closely. And the issue of civil-military relations is not a destination, it's a journey. And all of us in uniform in here have an absolute obligation to do the best we can to foster the best kind of relationship possible between the civilians and the military. Now, a couple of occasions, I would be required to testify. And I would get the question, well, what about this president's decision? Don't you think that was harebrained? You know, or don't you think the president has no idea what he's doing? And my response typically was, look, I'm going to give the President of the United States my best military advice. But guess what? His copy of the big picture is actually bigger than my copy of the big picture. And he'll take my advice in the context of his ultimate responsibility to the entire nation and the entire population and whatever it is we're doing. And he might take it. I was pretty pleased that they generally did. Or they might not take it. And they sometimes didn't. And I was lucky to work for presidents who explained to me why they didn't. And it typically made sense. Now, no Marines or soldiers got killed because they didn't take my advice, but it might have taken us in a different direction than I would have wanted or intended. So it's hard to overstate how important the civil-military relationship is because that's who we are as a country. The civilian leadership of this country controls the military forces. And we have an inherent obligation as uniformed officers to do all we can to make that relationship constructive and ultimately serve the needs of our country in the context of our Constitution.
Great. Well, I'd like to come back to the journey of civil military. Yes, you are. This is terrific. I'd like to come back to the journey of civil-military relations as you characterize it. I think it's a really rich and generative framing. But I wondered before we do that, if you could just take a minute or so to reflect on the large global context for American military power over the past 35 years, the period since the end of the Cold War. The post-Cold War period begins with a sort of emphatic assertion of American military predominance. The commentator Charles Krauthammer, I recall, proclaims a unipolar era, an era in which this country's margins of military dominance are so immense as to broker no credible challenges. How do you think the balance of military power has changed over the past 35 years? Has that immense margin of advantage been eroded, and if so, to what degree?
Well, it's changed by degrees, and this is not a binary answer. It's not yes, it's eroded, or no, it's not eroded. I think the first big change, of course, was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And much of the military might of the United States was bore-sighted, was focused on being able to repel a Soviet invasion of NATO. Consequently, the size of the Army, the size of the Air Force, the size of the Navy, less so the Marines, because we were kind of on the flank and in other places, but the size of our principal forces was right-sized and right-equipped to deal with the enormity of the Soviet war machine. And when that collapsed, we suddenly found ourselves in an environment where the question was rightly asked, is this the kind of force we still need in the world? Now, very shortly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had Desert Storm. Now, if Desert Storm had occurred 5 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we might have had a different outcome in Desert Storm. We might be fighting there today still. But the United States combined arms military, our Army and our Air Force, to a lesser extent the Navy, which obviously wasn't a big player in except in aviation and some shore bombardment, and the Marines, who went straight up the middle at one point, that force that trounced the combined arms of Saddam Hussein, that force was the force that would have crushed the Soviet force. And so we saw that force in action. We actually had the chance to see the validation of those years and years of spending when we saw the Army unleashed upon Iraq's war machine. But then we took that Army apart. We took that Air Force apart. We took the military apart in the aftermath. We really downsized in ways where we thought that big war was not going to occur now. The Soviets were out of business. Chinese had not really emerged as a major global power yet. And so we began to downsize the force, reap the benefits of less military spending. And that was probably the first of the dips. And then in the aftermath, as we began to expand NATO, we began to build the force again. We began to shift forces into the Pacific because the Chinese were becoming more assertive over time. But to the point of your first question, we found ourselves after 11 September 2001 committed irrevocably into the Middle East, which is a place we really hadn't been. You know, we'd been there for the first Gulf War, and I was the chief instructor, the director of the infantry officer course at the basic school. I had the responsibility of producing all the infantry officers. We hadn't been in the desert. Marine Corps has not fought in the desert for many, many years. No living Marine had fought in the desert. And I remember going down into the dusty archives of the library at the Marine Corps University and finding the digests of writings of the British Army in Mesopotamia and the things that they went through to fight. And we had to get ready to fight in an entirely new operational environment. But it continued, and we stayed there, and we didn't move, and we didn't pull out, and we have continued a presence in the Middle East to this day. Now, I was just at a conference where I was asked to speak about the global posture of U.S. forces. And the first part of the conversation was about NATO and U.S. focus on NATO, and are we going to pull out of NATO, and all of these questions about American commitment to NATO and Europe. And we will remain, and although there's a lot of noise sort of in the atmosphere right now, we're going to remain true to our NATO partners. I think the nature of our relationship with NATO will change. But the audience was full of Europeans who wanted me to constantly come back to how committed we are to Europe. And my response to them was, Europe's important to the United States. It really is. But our interests are global. Your interests are continental. Your interests revolve around a very successful military alliance for the defense of Europe. The United States has committed itself as a vital interest to prevent the energy of the Middle East from falling into the hands of a hostile power and trying all that we can to maintain stability in the Middle East. Thousands of Americans are in the Middle East and have been and will remain there for a very long period of time, a second major area of our global interests. And then we have East Asia. The United States is a Pacific nation. A lot of people don't hear that much. We are a Pacific nation, and our global trade with East Asia is enormous. You know, the CEO of TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, just committed $100 billion into Arizona for the production of microchip fabs. That wouldn't happen if we weren't a Pacific nation. But many of the countries in East Asia, and there was a long time when Europeans and Americans didn't believe that Asians actually could create a democracy. Well, it turns out some of the best democracies on the planet, functioning democracies, real democracies, with really strong economies that grew up in strong democracies, they're the lifeblood of much of our trade in East Asia. So that's a third major area for our vital interests. And presidents and Congress and the chairman and the Joint Chiefs and service and our combatant commanders have had to make difficult decisions over the years to apportion our combat power across the theaters so that we can secure our vital interests, which we hope are aligned with our values. That's a question now. To secure our vital interests, to ensure that we remain true to our treaty responsibilities in NATO. We remain true to the 5 defense treaties that we have in East Asia with Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Thailand, and Australia, with the Taiwan Agreement, the Taiwan Relations Act, a very strong, almost a treaty with them. So we are bound to a global environment. And this is where we ultimately have to have, a common meeting of the minds at a policy level within the Congress and within the military on how we'll apportion our strength and how we'll go about the business of weapons development, et cetera, to support those global commitments.
And history, of course, weighs powerfully upon how that apportionment of resources is made. And you give the powerful example of the North Atlantic Alliance as a commitment inherited from the past that continues to bear powerfully in U.S. policy. I wonder if I might ask you to reflect upon how institutional and bureaucratic structures inherited from the past affect military policy. This is a very big and open-ended question, but it's perhaps worth pausing to acknowledge that the U.S. military as an organization is not just one organization, but 4. When you compare the separate services that are such a defining aspect of U.S. military life that we often don't pause to point it out, with the organizational structure of the Chinese military, which is a single integrated People's Liberation Army, what are the downstream consequences of the organizational structure that we've inherited from the past? Does having separate services make the U.S. military less effective than it could be in some alternative universe?
I actually think the system works pretty well now. The problem is I don't want to take us there now. I think you're going to ask a question about technology in a few minutes. We are bureaucratically mired in being able to move fast enough, ultimately, to be relevant in this rapidly changing, technologically rich environment. But the 4 services, actually 5 services now, with the Space Force, the 5 service chiefs have the responsibility of preparing their forces for then being allocated to another group of individuals that we didn't talk about yet, and those are the combatant commanders. The entire world is divided up into regions, and there is a 4-star combatant commander who receives apportioned forces from all of those services, that those forces are apportioned to. I was a deputy commander and briefly the commander of Central Command. That's from Egypt to the line of contact with India, east of Pakistan, all of Central Asia, all of the Middle East. And every year, based on the strategy from the United States, we would develop our own strategy for how we would deal with maintaining stability, countering terrorism, and dealing with hostile powers inside the Central Command. And you turn those cranks, and out pops what we think is what we need from the Air Force, what we need from the Army, what we need from the Navy in terms of surface units, what we need from the Marine Corps. Space Force wasn't around yet, but what we needed obviously from the Air Force to provide us direct support from outer space. And those requirements, if you totaled up the Northern Command, the Southern Command, South America, the Africa Command, the European Command, the Central Command, the Indo-Pacific Command, if you total up what all those admirals and generals are cranking out every day in terms of what they think they need, there ain't enough. There isn't enough. So then we have to prioritize the theaters against which ones hold the greatest potential threat to American national interests and to our values. And then you begin to apportion the forces by prioritization within the theaters. I think that actually works pretty well. If it was only the 4 service chiefs, then we would have the difficulties that we had before Goldwater Nichols, which I think was one of the most important laws that was ever passed by our Congress. It mandated that our 5 services today, but the 4 services, had to fight in a joint force. Now, I could not be promoted to brigadier general unless I had served in a joint command to give me experience, ultimately, to command joint forces. Of the 10 years I was a general officer, I only spent 2 of those years in the Marine Corps. The rest of the time, I commanded joint forces either in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in the Middle East, mostly against Iran. And so we will always fight as a joint force. We will always prepare to fight by service. And the service chiefs, in consultation with the combatant commanders, will determine what the combatant commanders need and ultimately support them. And when I commanded the war in Afghanistan, Ray Odierno, my Army friends are in the back there, Ray Odierno was one of the greatest generals I ever knew. I mean, I just spent last night with Dave Petraeus, Ray Odierno, Stan McChrystal's a dear friend. Just 20 years of war is horrible, but we had the chance to create fellowships amongst the general officers that we had never seen in this country since the end of World War II. And Ray Odierno would show up in theater as the Chief of Staff of the Army. And he would say, "John, what do you need?" Or Nordy Schwartz, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, would show up in theater and say, "What do you need? What more can I do?" And I needed drones. I needed UAVs, because I was whacking the Al-Qaeda up along the Pakistani border. I needed them badly. And he shorted the number of drones in the Air Force school that creates UAV pilots and sent them over to me so I could use them in combat. So you've got the service chiefs, who are the providers. You have the combatant commanders, who are the warfighters. I think that relationship works pretty well.
Absolutely. Now, part of me is tempted to ask you what universities could learn from Goldwater Nichols if we want to escape the limitations of disciplinary siloization. But it's a question that will be of more interest to the dean and me than to most of the audience.
And if I embarked on that conversation, the meeting would be over.
So let me instead ask you this question. So you make a really powerful case for the transformational significance of Goldwater Nichols, which in effect supplants geographical organization upon the old system of service organization. Is geography in the 21st century still a sufficient basis for organizing senior military command, given the plethora of transnational and non-spatial or even post-spatial threats that the United States today confronts?
Couldn't have asked a better question in that regard, a more timely question. Because we have emerged into a world of multi-domain operations. I see people's head going up and down, so that must have been the class they just recently had, or they're writing books on it or papers on it. For many years, we had the luxury of, we didn't have to look too high into the sky to have to worry about what was going on in space. We didn't have to worry about what was going on in this thing that was unknown to us called the cyber environment. You know, we fought in the air, we fought on the ground, we fought on the sea, we fought under the sea. We fought in a physical environment, but multi-domain operations now is the rule of thumb because it has to be. And let me just take a moment to explain my view on this. We have the environment of conflict, and in that environment of conflict, periodically conditions will be created, usually by virtue of an absence or a decay of deterrence, where physical warfare will break out in the context of conflict. So today, we're in conflict with the Russians, every day. I was just in Taiwan. I flew here from Taiwan, where I was meeting with their senior leadership. They are attacked by Chinese in the cyberspace 600 million times a day. Now talk about warfare that is occurring in a domain of operations which keeps constant pressure on our societies, on our internet, on our cyber environment, because we know, and one of my jobs at Microsoft, not a job, one of the things I do at Microsoft is to work with the Microsoft Threat Analysis Center and the Microsoft Threat Intelligence Center, which is doing every single day massive analysis on Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and North Korean attacks upon our cyber environment. And they're very active and they're very aggressive, and they were in the last election. They're there in every election. They're seeking to separate us by gender. They're seeking to separate us by race. They're seeking to separate us by faith, to break down the cohesion of our population, to make us less resolute as a people, to make us less confident as individuals who'd be willing to give our lives for our democracy and the Constitution. And they're pounding away at us every single day in the cyber domain, in this multi-domain environment. And what you saw happen in Ukraine was that for years the Russians had been hammering away at the Ukrainians. And at the point where the Russians, probably observing American conduct in other places, determined that the deterrent of their attack of Ukraine was no longer great enough for them to be deterred, that's when the Russians emerged from a conflict into a physical war. Now, we're still fighting in multi-domain operations. Every single day, the Ukrainians are attacked across the cyber environment. The Russians are using their space capacity for precision targeting. And then, of course, we know how it's going for them on the ground, which isn't all that great. But that's the point I would make. In the modern era, we're fighting in a multi-domain operation, and we, ladies and gentlemen, are in conflict now. The question shouldn't be whether we are or not, or whether we should be or shouldn't be. The question for us is, how do we deter our opponents with the absolute and utter strength of our armed forces, to the extent that countries that would want to behave badly won't do it because of the potential for United States retaliation, or that we are sufficiently strong in cyberspace and in our physical environment that they are deterred from taking certain action. That's a question now, in my mind. It's a question as to whether we're able adequately to deter the Russians and the Chinese. And then just recently, of course, the Secretary of Defense ordered us to stop offensive cyber operations against the Russians and offensive cyber planning against the Russians. I don't think we want to get into the political issues here. But when we are under attack every single day by the Russians in cyberspace, so we've now decided not to oppose them or to plan against it, let's go out and have a fist fight, and I'll just put my hands behind my back. So that's kind of where we are at this point.
Absolutely. I wonder if we might pivot from the organization of command to the role of technology in military affairs. Maybe as a segue, could I ask you to reflect upon the implications of artificial intelligence for military leadership? I mean, prospectively, the technologists tell us that we're 2 or 3 years away from an artificial general intelligence capability. What might that mean for military command?
It's an interesting, the whole issue of AGI, or the super intelligent algorithm that exceeds human intellect and is able to learn at speeds that we can't even begin to imagine. So it will rapidly, not just be smarter than us, but rapidly outstrip our intellect. That's a few years off. Lots of folks are, very concerned about the potential for us to achieve AGI. I'm not so sure that's a bad thing. Because the speed by which, with AGI and the kinds of computing power we have today and the data that we have available, my guess would be we will resolve some diseases that have plagued us as a human species for hundreds or thousands of years. We'll solve those very quickly, especially when quantum computing comes online. As the commander of the war in Afghanistan, I had a cell that worked for me from an organization called DARPA. I see some heads going up and down. Those of you who know about DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Programs or Projects Agency, it is nearly a superhuman organization, operates in the dark. It applies resources to the most advanced technologies that the United States pursues. And DARPA gave me, as the commander, they brought certain projects out to the battlefield, and almost all of them were about artificial intelligence. Long before anybody was reading about artificial intelligence, DARPA gave me the capacity to find the Taliban. More importantly for me, I could deal with the Taliban, to find Al-Qaeda and to find some of the other groups that were really, really vicious groups that had the potential of creating crises between Pakistan and India, 2 nuclear powers, and they were intent on doing that. I needed to find them and I needed to deal with them, and DARPA, artificial intelligence, gave me the capacity to do that. That taught me then, as a commander, that the speed of decision-making that was now available to me, because these AI algorithms and the computing power that I had could sift through amounts of data that had traditionally been, or had previously been, sifted through by rooms full of people and days of work. And I was getting this information in hours or sometimes in minutes, giving me precision targeting information where I could either apply precise fires or my strike forces, my Delta SEALs or Rangers. That, to me, changed everything. And it meant to me that we were going to need, ultimately, to adopt artificial intelligence, the computing power that was going to accompany it, the capacity to acquire, clean, and apply data, mass data. And that was going to change everything for us. Now, if you've not read about it, there's a theory that is growing called hyperwar. Hyperwar is a very interesting theory. Hyperwar posits that with artificial intelligence being applied to many of the traditional, I'll use the military term, Army term, battlefield functions, we're going to start seeing something, a phenomenon called acceleration. Things are just going to move faster. And those of you who drove over here in a car that's a couple of years old, you got over here because of artificial intelligence. You got over here because your car was reading off the satellite constellation that gave you data that was processed by an algorithm in your car, a computer, and it looked like a map, and it got you here. Now that's just a microscopic example of how you'd have been reading maps, you'd have been asking people for directions. If you were me, you'd have pulled into multiple gas stations. But we as a society are beginning to experience the reality of acceleration. Everything is moving faster. And that's going to be applied to warfare. And as artificial intelligence speeds up the capacity to gather enormous amounts of information, intelligence, process it, and then disseminate it, and to take that information and provide it through algorithms to commanders so that I am provided options, courses of action, far faster than my staff could ever have produced them, because the algorithm is intended to produce courses of action. And I can then choose very quickly and move out. Now, everything's picking up speed now. Everything is faster. And then now the capacity for us to see the battlefield in ways we could never have seen it before, from space, from a constellation of drones that is filling the sky in Ukraine, to then apply fires from multiple spots on the battlefield, so those fires all converge at the same spot at the same second, and there might not have been a human anywhere in that process. That's hyperwar, and that's where technology is leading us. Now, for us, frankly, in the West, bear with me for a second, warfare inherently is about inflicting death and destruction. The difference between our forces in the United States and, say, the Russians, or the Chinese, or you pick them, if they're not us, our NATO allies not included, we have chosen to confine our capacity to deliver death and destruction within a system of laws, because we are a people of laws, and because inherently we are governed by a bias for a humanitarian commitment to our fellow human. War inherently, in inflicting death and destruction, war inherently is about homicide. We in the U.S. military swear an oath to defend the Constitution and live by the principles, which means that we will apply force on the battlefield in a manner that is applied to enemy combatants and to enemy infrastructure. But we won't kill innocents. That is the difference in war between homicide and murder. It's important to understand that. We sometimes get these two confused. And sometimes American forces, and I as a commander will live for the rest of my life with the reality that my forces killed innocent people. We didn't set out to do it. We didn't mean to do it, but we did it. And I've got to live with that the rest of my life. But I didn't set out to commit murder. This is what makes us different. And this is why, as we apply these advanced technologies, we as a society have an absolute moral and ethical obligation to apply these technologies in a way that is consistent with our commitment to our compassion and our humanitarian commitment to our fellow human. That's the law of armed conflict. That's the Uniform Code of Military Justice. That's the international humanitarian law. One of my greatest friends, when I was the commander in Afghanistan, was the international director of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. Now, he didn't tell me how to fight the war because he knew that I was committed to fighting the war in conjunction with my humanitarian instincts. I'll kill them if I have to, but I'll do everything I can to preserve life, to preserve the lives of the innocents. It's really hard when you have algorithms on the battlefield that have been released into the battle space applying force in accordance with the law. All commanders, I was responsible for it as well, I held my people responsible. All commanders have three responsibilities in fighting a war. The first is that if you must apply lethal force, it must be necessary. So you're not out there killing everybody all the time. It has to be necessary if you must take human life. The second thing is if you've chosen to do that as a commander, you must be able to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants so that you apply lethal force only to those individuals on the battlefield who are the combatants, and you actively try to preserve the lives of the civilians. My experience in Fallujah was we did everything we could to get the civilians, the non-combatants, out of the city so that all that was left was Al-Qaeda. And we went at them with full force, knowing that if there were still some civilians there, we gave them the chance to get out. We weren't going to hurt them if we got up close to them, but it was a city full of Al-Qaeda at that point, and we went after them. So, necessity, distinction, and the third is proportionality. You can't drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a house that's got people in it and a couple of combatants. You've got to have proportionality. There is no artificially intelligent algorithm today in any of our systems that can do those three things. The Chinese don't care about this. The Russians absolutely don't care about this. Other forces that we may fight who are not so confined as we are to an utter human commitment to the Constitution and the laws of our land and a international humanitarian law, they don't care about that. This is what makes it hard for Americans to go to war. Because while we're really good at killing the bad guys, sometimes it's really hard to preserve the lives of the good guys. And this is the challenge that we face now with these very advanced technologies.
Let me ask you, this has been enormously powerful, but let me ask you to elaborate on the implications for civil-military relations in the United States. Under, the chain of command as it is presently constituted, right? Any order to utilize lethal force must by necessity pass through a chain of command that comprises dozens and dozens of individuals, all of whom have sworn an oath to the Constitution, all of whom understand what the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions, demand of them. Insofar as the application of artificial intelligence has within it the potential to radically circumscribe that command chain, do you worry about the implications for, how do I put this delicately, political decisions to use lethal force that might be inconsistent with our values as a humane and lawful people?
Yeah, I'm not sure I follow the entire question, but I get you. I think I get you. If I don't answer it, stop me. When I was a commander in Afghanistan, I operated under the authority of a United Nations Security Council resolution. And as you may know, we only promote to 2 stars in the United States military. Beyond 2 stars, you are appointed to a very specific position. So you're a 3-star or a 4-star. So I was appointed to command the war in Afghanistan, and with that appointment came a whole series of authorities that derived from law. But my initial authority was from the UN Security Council resolution and American and international law that accompanied my appointment. And Afghanistan was, if you draw a line around the border, had been designated as an area of hostilities. Therefore, I had full and complete responsibility to apply force as I felt necessary within that area of hostilities, because I was the commander to do that. When you introduce advanced technologies into the battlefield, it does not obviate any responsibility by the commander to apply the 3 stipulations of the law of armed conflict. So if you're contemplating, as technology gets better, and right now on the battlefield in Ukraine, fully autonomous systems have been interjected into the battle space. I don't know that we would do that yet. But for Ukraine, it's an existential moment for them. They've got to fight every possible way they can because the Russians are killing them by the thousands, and they're coming at them by the thousands, and the Ukrainians are doing whatever they can to survive. But that, for us as commanders, that does not obviate our inherent responsibility to apply the 3 stipulations of the law of armed conflict. So what that means is, if we're going to apply artificial intelligence in a battle space, those algorithms that we apply must be explainable. They also have to be supervisable. So this is the conversation you hear frequently about making sure that there is a human in the loop. When that system goes out into the battle space and it is probably following a track that has been put together for them that will lead them, based on our intelligence, to a potential target. So as that system gets out there, it will acquire the target. It will then identify the target, and it will then engage the target. We don't permit our systems to do that unilaterally now, autonomously. There is, for us, still a human in the loop. And that human in the loop is somewhere between target acquisition and target engagement, so that as the system indicates, this is what I'm looking at, you told me to come out here, I think I've got the target, the human in the loop validates he does have the system has the target, and off the rails comes the Hellfire missile. That is not going to change for us. So the question becomes, in a hyperwar environment, as everything is accelerating, and your opponent does not have a human in the loop because the opponent doesn't care whether someone gets killed or not, is innocent or not. But when the human is not in the loop, they move faster than we do. So the challenge we have is to be able to fight in a hyperwar environment, but do so ethically and morally and in accordance with the law when our opponents will not. Now, what this also means is that we get our people working hard on the upstream quality of the algorithms, so that the algorithm is so reliable to fulfill the three requirements of the commander that when the commander releases that autonomous system into the battlefield, the commander has complete confidence, nearly complete confidence, that that system can acquire, ID, and engage a target without a human being in the loop. That gets us going faster. And we've said before, we're not going to ever do that. And I heard the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs make that comment one day. We will never have fully autonomous systems because we want to be in charge of where the bombs go. And then the next day, an American aircraft dropped a 2,000-pound bomb on an Iraqi rifle company maneuvering against the Islamic State. So even the very best computer system on the planet, which is between the ears of our Air Force fighter pilots, even the very best will sometimes have that happen. It's not going to be zero defects. So we have to be prepared for those kinds of things. Sorry for that long explanation, but as we embrace emerging and advancing technologies, we have the inherent tension between moving fast, living with acceleration, preparing for hyperwar, and not giving up our values. That's who we are as a people. We will never give up our values. So those values may be redefined in the context of a much better and farther advanced algorithm rather than having somebody second guessing the drone on the battlefield. We don't have to now because we have such confidence in the algorithm. I don't know that we're there yet, and we're not there because we're not doing it yet.
So you're confident, to put it simply, that military command in the United States can remain a profession and will not become a technology?
Yes, I'm confident. I mean, if we remain true to the principles that we have always espoused, that commanders command within the law, commanders command within the bounds of their oath of office. You know, before I was a raid force commander on a number of occasions with the 6th Fleet, and we were getting ready to go out. It didn't look good. We didn't know we were going to end up, and I went on leave and took my family with me. We went to the National Archives, and there was an original copy of the Constitution on display. I'd never seen it before. Yet, over and over again in my career, I'd sworn to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, meaning prepared to give my life. And I stood there looking at this Constitution, and my daughters came up to me and said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And I said, "I have sworn to give my life for this set of laws my entire life. I'd never seen it before today." But that's who we are. That's who we are as a people. That's who we are as a country. And I hope that doesn't change.
Absolutely. Now, a critical purpose for this lecture is to give the up-and-coming generation of military commanders who will be taking that oath and committing their lives to the defense of the Constitution opportunity to pose questions to you, General Allen. So I would like to suggest at this juncture that we pivot to the next stage in our conversation, and I will exit the stage, and our students will have the opportunity to put questions to you. And at this point, I believe for the audiovisual team, we're going to transition to a Chatham House Rules version of this conversation. So we're going to discontinue the recording.